unbridled success of the Super Nintendo, Nintendo had a firm grasp on the market. However, not everything was as rosy as it seemed. Nintendo had competition upcoming, and it came from an unlikely source. With the rise of disc-based media becoming the norm and a less focus on cartridges, Nintendo sought out to find a hardware partner for using CDs. This led them to Sony, who helped revolutionize the CD format with Philips. However, with the release of the so-called Nintendo PlayStation to make disc-based games available for the Super Nintendo, Nintendo grew uneasy with the terms of the contract, as Sony would have partial control over any IPs published on the Nintendo PlayStation. Nintendo was very protective of all of their IPs, and thus decided not to go through with the deal. However, not without a few shady business practices of their own. Without telling Sony, Nintendo decided to not go through with the deal, instead switching the partnership over to Philips to develop the disc-based add-on. However, not before letting Sony announce the Nintendo PlayStation on stage at CES that year. This caused Sony intense humiliation. After the utter humiliation that Sony suffered at CES of that year, they decided that out of pure spite, they would enter the video game market and market their very own PlayStation. The PlayStation was a 32-bit architecture system that was fully capable of taking advantage of both 2D and 3D capabilities, something that the Super Nintendo really was not designed for. This further bridged the generational gap, and Nintendo knew they were going to have an answer. With generational divide now going forward, Nintendo wanted something to bridge the gap between their upcoming Project 64 and something a bit more powerful than the Super Nintendo. This would be known as the Virtual Boy, a handheld that will let you bring virtual reality into the home. Now, the idea of using weather technology has been something that Nintendo has built its company on. They've done this with both the Game Boy and the Nintendo. However, in this case, it may have been done prematurely. Now, the problem was that Nintendo was using red LEDs for the display instead of normal color LEDs due to the inefficiency of LED technology at the time, using both a lot of power and the lack of portability that this would provide. However, the red LEDs ended up causing another problem: headaches, especially with close proximity to your face. With the launch of the Virtual Boy, hopes were very high for the system. Sales were slow but steady, not as high as the Game Boy, but with marked improvement. However, due to word-of-mouth concerns and the console giving people headaches, as well as the unappealing nature of some of the games, many people were turned off from the Virtual Boy. This resulted in a lot of unsold units, and the system being declared dead less than a year later. This led Nintendo to focus primarily on Project 64. With the unveiling of Project 64, also known as the Nintendo 64, there was a general hype around the system as it was a full generation ahead of the PlayStation, which had already been around for about 3 years during this time. The system was generally graphically more superior, much faster, and used cartridges instead of the CD-ROM format that the PlayStation was using. However, this came at a cost. They decided to once again use the weather technology of game cartridges. This, however, was not a great idea in hindsight. While cartridges were very fast, they were not very big. This resulted in a lot of games having to be compressed and or cut down in comparison to games such as the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. Lots of people noticed this and decided to pick up the inferior versions of the PlayStation and Sega Saturn releases compared to the Nintendo 64. The 64 was indeed considered a success. They lost a lot of third-party support due to this changeover to cartridges and their refusal to move towards CDs. Squaresoft, one of their biggest RPG makers in the world at the time, with their Final Fantasy series, decided to not release Final Fantasy VII, their upcoming game, on the Nintendo 64 due to the sheer space requirements of it, and being constrained to just 64 megabytes of space. Squaresoft decided not to release Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64 due to the sheer space requirements and the lack thereof on the Nintendo 64, and instead went over to Sony. Looking back, The Nintendo 64 and Virtual Boy both had their successes and their failures. However, it was clear that Nintendo was starting to lose its spark. They needed to do something very big, very bold, and very revolutionary. Tune in next time to see us look at the revolution.